they are in a sense trapped, and they're only 1 year into their government. Spending went up by about 70 billion a year, taxes went up by about 40 billion a year, and then there was going to be an extra 30 billion of borrowing.
He is a member of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and they do say very explicitly, our end goal is collective ownership, workers' ownership of the means of production. So we had this idea that the history of socialism ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It has defeated itself. It has failed in practice. We all accept now that prosperous economies need to be market-based economies. And in 2015-16 became clear that that isn't true. Millions of people don't believe in a market economy.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here, and today I'm joined by our Executive Director, Tom Clougherty, and our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. Now, the big topic today is that it's officially a year since Labour won the election in the UK, but also there's a few other things flying about that we're going to get our teeth into, not least the re-rise of socialism and a question about fuel duty. But before we do that, do subscribe to us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk, or you can find it on our website. That way you can get all of our content, our podcasts, our blogs, our events straight to your inbox. Now, 4th of July 2024 was the day that Britain went to the polls and elected a huge Labour majority after 14 years of Conservative-led government. So 1 year on, how do we think it's done? Now, I'm going to do the annoying thing and ask you both to give, like a good schoolmaster, a grade from A star to a F, I guess, on how you think the Labour government has performed in their first year. Tom?
All right, well, let me come to the grade in a minute. I'll think my way towards it. Look, I think they were dealt a bad hand and they've played it poorly. I'll focus on the growth mission. Now, they talked a lot in opposition about growth being the number one priority. I think the problem here has been, and we haven't seen much progress on that front, to be clear. I think the problem is that instinctively, the Labour Party wants to be a kind of Bidenomics party. That's their view of going for growth. It's the entrepreneurial state. It's big, publicly funded investments, it's government-led industrial strategy. Now, the problem is they realised, because they are rational people, Britain doesn't have the money for that kind of thing. So it wasn't going to work. So instead, I think they've pivoted a little bit towards supply-side reform, but they've done it without conviction, and they've done it really without knowing what does it mean. There's not a lot of ambition there. There's not a lot of detail there. So although you hear some encouraging things, say, on house building, they're not the kind of big structural reforms that are going to move the needle in the long run. They're the kind of classic thing you had from successive governments where maybe they will make an impact while the government's attention is there and while political energy is focused in that direction, but it won't really change anything much in the long run. I think the other problem, because this kind of supply-side liberalisation agenda isn't really natural territory for Labour. I would argue, based on the last 15 years, it's not really natural territory for any political force in the UK. But this isn't necessarily the language that the British centre-left has traditionally spoken. I think they just had this assumption, well, we're going to say we're prioritising growth. We can't do it the way we want to. We'll do the supply side stuff instead. We'll ask the civil servants and the regulators what they think we should do. And I think that's why you've had a very underwhelming first year in terms of economic policy. So we haven't really seen any progress on supply-side regulatory reform that would boost growth. At the same time, and we've talked about this lots before, there are many other things that the government is doing, say on net zero or on workers' rights, which probably push in the opposite direction. And I think we also need to consider the fiscal side of the equation. So the first budget last autumn, it was basically a big tax, spend and borrow budget. So I think spending went up by about 70 billion a year. Taxes went up by about 40 billion a year. And then there was going to be an extra 30 billion of borrowing. Now, I think ironically, and we're seeing this now in some of the contemporary political developments in the UK, that extra cash for public services just wasn't enough to keep the Labour coalition happy or for them to do maybe the things that naturally they want to do. At the same time, the 40 billion tax increase was really far too much for business to bear. And I think you're seeing that come through in business confidence surveys and in falling payroll employment. And of course, that added debt left the government, left the Chancellor, with almost no headroom against the fiscal rules, which they had already described as sort of sacrosanct. And that's a big problem. And I think that, just to tie it all together, that feeds into what we've seen this week with the government climbing down on its welfare bill, with the Chancellor looking very upset in the House of Commons for whatever reason, and I don't want to speculate about that, but then with seemingly a kind of dip in market confidence with gilt yields spiking and the pound cooling off a little bit. So I think what that points to is actually a very difficult fiscal dilemma for the government, which, to be clear, they kind of inherited, but they've done nothing to make better. If anything, they've made it worse. I think their inability to get any spending restraint through their own coalition in Parliament is going to make things harder and harder. We're going to be talking endlessly about what taxes are going up next, That's going to have a chilling effect as well. And unless you see some quite robust regulatory reform on the supply side, which I'm honestly not anticipating anything particularly exciting happening, well, then I think they're in a bit of a pickle. They are, in a sense, trapped, and they're only 1 year into their government. They've got 4 years left, but it's hard for me to see where do they go from here without really gambling in one direction or another. So if you're going to force me to give a grade, maybe you'll say this is a bit generous. I mean, I'll give them a C. Maybe a C minus. I think it's too soon to give them an F. And in many respects, they have been a continuation of the poor government we had before they were elected, rather than some new lurch in an altogether unwelcome direction. Although, as I say, there have been things they've done on tax and there are things they're doing on regulation, which I do think push us in the wrong direction. So it's, when the bond rating agencies give their kind of ratings, they give sort of the rating, but then which way it's leaning for the future. And I would say at the moment, maybe it's a C grade. But the leaning would be towards a downgrade in future, the way things are going.
Good. Kristian, what's your take?
I'm going with C minus as well, although that will be a weighted average, and they would get very different grades in different policy areas. So, and we've said this many times on this podcast, on the tax and spend, the fiscal side, terrible. Labor market, terrible. Industrial strategy, well, could have been worse, but not great. But then there is the saving grace of the at least timid reforms on the supply side. And in the current context, if we look at where the British economy is right now and has been for some time, it wouldn't be really appropriate to give a weighted average in the way you do it with school subjects where they all get the same weight, because that is the one bottleneck area that is vastly more important than everything else that happens in the economy. And so doing even just relatively okay on that one front, I think can cancel out a lot of bad things that they've been doing elsewhere. So, and that's why it's such a shame that even though they have this, yes, okay, it's only skin deep. It's something that they've discovered in the last minute, the supply side agenda. But nonetheless, they've been doing a little bit, and the OBR forecasts show that there is already a detectable impact that those minor reforms are having. That's why it's such a shame that they're wasting political capital on completely unnecessary things, rather than, even on its own terms, even if they don't fully believe it, even if they don't feel in their bones, this is who we are, this is why we're in government for, this is our political project, even if it isn't that, just by realizing, okay, this is where we can make gains without really upsetting a major part of our coalition, why not go full force for that? And I just don't get it, even on their own terms. I'm not talking about why don't they do what we think a government should be doing, but even just from their own perspective, I don't really get it. But what we've seen over this 1 year is, I guess, the refutation of the good vibes theory of governance, where, just before the last election, I was at an airport where my flight was delayed, so I made the mistake of buying James O'Brien's book, How They Broke Britain, which is a series of baddies, people he hates, whom he blames for...
Do we feature?
We are. Yeah, some of us are even named individually. Yeah. So yes, we're definitely in there. We're some of the people who broke Britain. The problem with the book, apart from obviously James O'Brien being massively irritating about everything, but there's not much in terms of, he doesn't identify specific policies that he think broke Britain, other than obviously Brexit, which is his main bugbear. But it's not that he says, okay, it's policies A, B, C, and D, and they need to be reversed and they need to be replaced with something else. It's all, there are people in, well, either government or in some institution that he considers powerful, and he says, well, these are bad people, they're incompetent, they have bad vibes, I don't like them, and therefore Britain is in the state it is. Well, okay, that's really been comprehensively refuted now. Because for a while, and I mean, James O'Brien, unfortunately, he matters. He has more than 1 million fans, and people who bought into this idea that you just need sensible people. You need the grown-ups need to be in charge, not clowns like Boris Johnson, but serious people, and then everything will be well. And well, okay, I mean, the current lot, I guess, what the good vibes theory people would have wanted, and well, apparently that isn't enough.
Yeah.
We have had the change in vibes, but what we haven't seen is a major change in policy terms, and no surprise.
And I mean, not to be terribly dreary about this, but I think it's interesting just to talk about the housing aspect a little bit more, because yes, and you've written about it for us, haven't you, how the OBR numbers show that even a little move in the right direction can have a relatively significant economic impact. But I also think it's worth mentioning the piece that Rob Colville, our old boss from the Centre for Policy Studies, wrote. I think it was his Sunday Times column last week, about how incredibly weak the housing start figures are in England, particularly in London, where you would think the need for additional housing units would be the most pronounced. And, I think effectively what's happening there is even where you should surely have serious market demand and an opportunity for private investment, this shouldn't be something that the government has to get particularly involved in to make it happen. They just have to move barriers out of the way. Even in London, you are loading house builders up with so many new regulatory requirements and burdens that it's undermining the viability of development. And this is in London. So when you look at the government's housing targets, and the housing targets are skewed away from London and the southeast, where in fact it would make the most sense if you're going to do this target-driven system for it to be flipped the other way. They're putting a huge amount of emphasis on new social housing, on new affordable housing, on this, that, and everything else. And I just frankly wonder whether even the quite modest boost to house building that the government is trying to inspire, whether that will actually materialize and whether it will have the kind of growth impact that we would want it to and expect it to, and that the OBR forecasts, if at the same time they're making the business of private development unviable through ever-increasing regulatory restrictions.
I think you're right. I think my own grade would probably be a D for all the reasons you suggest, but adding in the political context that they had 14 years of preparation time, if you like. Okay, maybe not exactly the leadership that they have now, but they had and they've got a huge majority. From what we've seen this week, they haven't been able to deliver that huge majority, to deliver a relatively, in the grand scheme of things, small cut. So what does this tell us? And speaking to your point, Kristian, about the vibes change having no significant change in terms of actual outcomes, does that mean that we are basically doomed to this doom loop for the foreseeable? Is there any real hope of serious structural change, or do we have to see some form of bigger breakdown first?
I mean, I don't think we're doomed, and I don't think the government is doomed either, but they are in a very tight situation, I think. And maybe the events of the last few days lay bare the fiscal fragility of Britain. I think it's fairly well known now that we're spending over 100 billion a year on debt interest. Our debt, according to conventional measures, is about 100% of GDP already. Actually, if you factor in things like unfunded pension liabilities, you can pretty much double that. And that situation will get worse as the population ages, absent any policy change and change in the economic trajectory. So when you have that kind of fiscal outlook, when you don't really have strong growth prospects, and frankly, we don't at the moment, I see nothing really to make me think that the trajectory of economic growth is going to be any different over the next 5 years than it was over the last 10. So, if we get 1.2, 1.3% GDP growth, and that's not even in per capita terms, that's sort of the baseline expectation. It could easily be worse, I think. This doesn't paint a very pretty picture. And the issue is that when you don't have cash to splash around, when you don't have a growing economy that would make that possible, everything becomes zero sum, and everything is about distribution, and it's a fight over scarce resources, how you carve up the pie effectively and who gets what, not how do you grow the pie. This is a kind of nightmarish scenario, I think, to try and govern in. And, I do fear, actually, that politics, far from, what was that famous quote, isn't this nice, the quiet, that once the sensible grown-ups were in charge, everything would go back to normal. That hasn't happened, and politics is getting more and more angry and more negative. And I think unless things change on the economic and fiscal side, that's probably going to continue. And that probably has some quite unpleasant political implications down the line. But this stuff isn't predetermined, right? It is possible. I think the way out for the government here is to accept they're in a very difficult fiscal bind. So they have to, and they need economic growth. So they have to focus on kind of non-fiscal pro-growth measures. And they have to actually put growth first. And I don't think that this should be impossible with their political coalition. There are things that make it difficult, obviously. But I think you're seeing this in the US, and we talked about it before with the kind of Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson abundance meme that progressives are adopting in the US. The left, the centre-left, doesn't have to be the party of bureaucracy and regulation, right? That's not inherent in their DNA. They could, and I guess like, the famous Roger Douglas, the great liberaliser in New Zealand, that was a left-wing government who was in an extremely difficult economic situation and saw that they needed radical, we would say, free market reform to get out of it. Could a Labour government do that, one that has a big majority? Maybe they could. I'm not going to bet on it, but I don't think we're doomed. We're just in a very difficult political cycle that it'll take a huge burst of energy to break free from.
Yeah, so a lot of commentators like to complain about how Britain's elites are all America-brained, how they pick up everything that happens over there. In this particular case, that could be a good thing. If the abundance agenda spills over, if larger sections of the centre-left here think, well, maybe this is what we should adopt as well, because it would suit this country, in fact, much better than the US even. This would be the perfect test case for an abundance agenda, simply because we have an economy that deprives itself of key input factors, and that's where the abundance philosophy fits in perfectly. I'm sure there are economies where it wouldn't work so well because they would have already picked the low-hanging fruits and need to do other things. But this would be the perfect test case. This would be, if you wanted to test it somewhere, test it here. So maybe that's where that's one source of hope, that maybe on the center left people will take inspiration from that. But that's a very, an indirect source of hope.
And I think this week's Economist has some interesting kind of polling focus group stuff about the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, the Labour government, how they're doing, how they'll be judged. And this is just pulling one line out of a broader piece. But I think that article says the single biggest thing that would make the voters they spoke to vote for Labour at the next election is have their energy bills fallen. Mm-hmm. Right? And that is, if you're going to do that, of course, I suppose you could do it by subsidy. Please, let's not do that. You have to do that through supply-side reform, by making energy more expensive, by expanding the supply, by getting rid of a lot of the regulatory constraints and taxes and everything else you've got on there at the moment. If they're getting that clear a message that this is one thing that we need to do, sort of a gateway to being voted in again, and you can guarantee that, say, the Reform Party will go very hard on this issue as well, maybe that's an interesting test. Will they change course somewhat on the net zero stuff, which, all things being equal, will make energy bills continue to rise? Or will they stick with it?
Well, one development that we've had this week to see what the left, in the broader sense, is going to do is the re-emergence of Jeremy Corbyn and the sort of harder left, if you like, for lack of a better term, in the UK. Now, this is quite a good example of a bit of a fork in the road for what the left and the Labour Party does. Does it go down the sort of pro-growth abundance agenda to sort of solve this problem, or does it look at it through the zero-sum lens that you mentioned and turn to the good old ideas of socialism, effectively? Kristian, you're the expert on this. Why won't socialism, the failed idea, die?
Well, somebody should write a book about it. Yeah. Well, I mean, I was last week. I was on a podcast, a Canadian one, where this was in response to the Mamdani victory, or in New York, where I mean, this would be quite ironic. New York is an iconic capitalist city. I mean, Ayn Rand was a massive admirer of New York and described the skyline in very colorful terms. And a city like that having a socialist mayor would be a huge symbolic victory. So what this Canadian podcast host did was he Googled why does socialism keep coming back? But then you can guess what came up. But yeah, I'm not surprised by the Mamdani victory. This is simply what we've had over the past 10 years, this revival of socialism, millennial socialism as it's been called, that hasn't gone away with Corbyn resigning as leader of the Labour Party. So too many people on the centre-right, but also people on the centre-left, non-socialists on the left, have convinced themselves that this was an absolute one-off that can never be repeated. Whereas I'd say that's completely the wrong diagnosis. We've had this shift among particularly millennials towards socialism. And it's just that this socialist movement is an extremely vibes-based, vibes-driven one. And that means they're not self-organized. So they always need a symbolic figurehead. If there is no such figurehead, it can look as if they were going away and losing interest in socialism. But what it really means is they're just hibernating. And as soon as you have a symbolic figure that they can rally around, somebody who sends the right vibes, it will immediately spring back into action. And that's what happened in New York, that this candidate immediately had tens of thousands of volunteers. And that's how he was so successful, that the others relied on conventional, traditional campaign spending. He didn't have much of that, but he had all these volunteers who decided to volunteer for him. And that's exactly what happened here in the Corbyn years, where you just had this army of enthusiastic young people. And the Labour Party in those years didn't even need. I think they could have decided not to run an election campaign even, because Twitter would have done the job for them. The whole of Twitter was on their side. I don't even remember their official campaign. I just remember all the Twitter hashtags and memes, and that then inspires people to also go knocking on doors. And so you just have this euphoric youth movement around socialism. And well, this is the end of history. So for about a quarter century, we had this idea that the history of socialism ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It has defeated itself. It has failed in practice. We all accept now that prosperous economies need to be market-based economies. And well, in 2015-16, it became clear that that isn't true. Millions of people don't believe in a market economy. They do believe in something fundamentally different, even if they can't spell out what exactly that would look like. And this candidate in New York is no exception. So he is a member of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and they do say very explicitly, our end goal is collective ownership, workers' ownership of the means of production. So they want a purely socialist economy. They don't mean socialism in the sense of let's just be nice and have a state-run healthcare program or something. So these are pure, proper socialists, and this is part of the mainstream debate again.
I mean, I think when a country's kind of economic engine breaks down and when governments appear to be dysfunctional in whatever way, and I think you can see both of those things across most Western countries, then I think that's where you get this resurgence of socialism on the one hand and also of kind of nationalist populism on the other hand, because the seeming failure of the status quo leads people to search for radical alternatives. And it also naturally makes them think less about, is there a danger to what we've already got? If it's like, well, what do we stand to lose anyway? Why don't we gamble on something completely different and completely radical? You can see why these ideas bubble up. And, I think, in a way, this goes back to the founding of the IEA, isn't it? Hayek's idea was that liberalism, classical liberalism, has to also be an exciting, inspiring alternative, and that you have to make it clear how it's fundamentally different. It's a third direction in which things can go. It's not just the perpetuation of the failing status quo. So I think there's a challenge there for people who believe the things we do to make our case better and substantiate it more. But equally, again, I mean, I think it's just if the sort of the centre, the broad centre of politics, the centre left and the centre right, can't get itself together, if it allows itself to be just fundamentally trapped and incapable of doing anything, and can't take short-term unpopular decisions that will have positive long-term payoffs in terms of economic growth or improving the fiscal position or whatever, then I think they're going to cede ground to these potentially quite unpleasant alternatives at both ends of the spectrum. And that we've talked about this guy in New York. And of course, I think overnight we saw a potential development in the UK as well, with Zara Sultana, a fairly left-wing Labour MP, resigning from the Labour Party, saying she was splitting off on her own. It appears unclear at this moment whether Jeremy Corbyn is actually with her or not, or whether she sort of preempted him and assumed that he would be involved. And then a lot of the kind of very left-wing independents that you have in Parliament at the moment, many of whom have been inspired by the sort of Gaza issue. Maybe they'll get together as well. Maybe the Greens also will get together. It's sort of unclear. I mean, you could end up with an incredibly fragmented left, with everyone just pursuing their own or grinding their own particular axe, or you could get a coming together within the British political spectrum of a sort of coherent and significant far left grouping. Now, this would be very dangerous for the Labour Party. It would almost inevitably drag the Labour Party to the left, make it more difficult for them to do in government many of the things I've just said they need to do if they're going to succeed, and probably if they're going to win again, although that's really none of my concern. They will probably have to protect their left flank. So we get a drift to the left, even if this sort of Corbynista party doesn't actually stand the chance of winning that many seats, and who knows, maybe it will. So we could be sort of shaking the political kaleidoscope again. And I suppose we do come back to it quite often, don't we? Our colleague Steve Davies' realignment theory. If you end up with a kind of national populist reform on the one hand. And by the way, I don't think it's clear at this point what direction reform will go. I mean, I still think they could be a broadly Thatcherite party that's, you know, kind of speaks patriotically and is tough on law and order and immigration. Fine. That's not particularly out of step with the traditional right, but it could morph into something which is much more of a authoritarian collectivist force over time. Equally, if you get this radical left emerging and growing and picking up support the way I think that similar groups have in Germany and other European countries, well, then you could be coming towards a point where politics really does realign and classical liberals are kind of left out in the cold, and the sort of standard neoliberal centre-left, centre-right, which has been dominant for a long time, really just shrivels away. I mean, in a sense, this is like the situation that France is in, where Macron and his En Marche party are kind of holding the centre together, but serious pressure from the left, serious pressure from the right. The conventional socialists and whatever they were most recently called, I forget in France, Les Républicains, have really fallen away. Could we be in that situation, kind of last stand of the centre and then more radical alternatives, but not ones which are necessarily helpful towards classical liberalism, step in and take over? That's all speculation at this point. One MP resigned last night, but it's not implausible, and it's not difficult to kind of think through the steps that would happen to lead us in that direction.
Yeah.
Your small addition on your first point on the economic drivers of this. So I read somewhere, I looked at an electoral breakdown, so who were the people who voted for Mamdani, who were his supporters. And it was quite clear that at first sight it looks a bit counterintuitive that these were relatively affluent people. These were people who, so they're certainly not the proletariat rising up. So this is not what Karl Marx would have envisaged. But they're also people who, while they would be quite well off pretty much anywhere else in the US, in the context of New York specifically, with high housing costs, not so much. So there, the housing situation is different from most of the rest of the country. And there it does lead back to our old core topic where, you may have seen this book by Brian Kaplan, where he, I think it's called Build Baby Build. So it's about, it overlaps a lot with my own home win, but his is more about the US situation. And the one big difference between home win and his book is that, well, I'm writing about the British situation, so I'm saying it's bad everywhere. he doesn't. In the US context, generally there are large parts of the country where housing affordability is not a big problem. Right? There are large parts of the country where the ratio of house prices to incomes in that region is not particularly high. But what happens there is that they have some pockets where that is not the case, and maybe pockets isn't quite the right word, because these are, well, the big cities, and the culturally influential cities. And he singles out New York a couple of times. That's one of the parts of the country where they have problems similar to the ones that we observe here. So you can have large numbers of people who do quite well in the labor market and who would, by most conventional measures, be quite affluent, but who still feel that they're struggling in the housing market. Now, I'm not one of those people who reduce every political conflict to an economic conflict. I mean, that's a Marxist way of approaching it. Would be quite ironic if I did. But nonetheless, I think there is a difference between, you could, even if New York had super cheap housing for everyone, there would be some socialists because it would still be hugely fashionable. But the question is always, to what extent does this spill over? To what extent does this mobilize people who are not very political? So you will always have the Twitter influencers and the TikTok influencers. There will always be socialists among those because that's the trendy ideology, obviously. But why does that bother somebody who is just relatively apolitical? Where do these people go? And there, I think these more economic arguments do matter. And that's why their housing situation does matter. And that's why, it is for a reason. I'm sure some viewers will be bored with us coming back to this topic time and again. And I'm sure we are sometimes bored with it ourselves. But it just is such a big determinant of a lot of things that happen.
Yeah. So it basically depends on, to bring those 2 points together, on the sort of centre, the managerial neoliberals, the two main parties in the UK, whatever you want to call it, getting their act together a bit and solving these problems. I mean, just to illustrate exactly your point, Tom, Zara Sultana said yesterday when she resigned that the two main parties are offering nothing but managed decline and broken promises. So it's just a prime example of what...
So for once, I agree with Zara Sultana. You heard it here first.
Before we wrap up, we're going to talk about something a little bit more unique, a little bit more specific on fuel duty. So the context of this is fuel duty has been sort of frozen budget after budget for ages in the UK, was recently cut, or a few years ago was cut by 5p, but has been, there's been question marks of whether that cut has been passed on to consumers, which poses an interesting question for us who believe in the market. What role is there for the state to intervene in those situations, or to either through the regulator, the CMA, are investigating and not trying to put pressure on the companies to pass on the tax cut, but also questions about price transparency.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is taken from a piece that Harry Wallop has written, I think, in the business section of the Times today. And this is something I either didn't know or I'd forgotten about. But when the 5p cut in fuel duty was introduced, it was noticed that the retailers hadn't really passed it on to consumers. In the 38 days that Kwasi Kwarteng was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he asked the CMA to look into this, and they found indeed that the petrol stations weren't passing the fuel duty cut on to consumers. Now, that's their right. They set their own prices. It's a competitive market. But the CMAs, and it's the Competition and Markets Authority, their solution was to require that eventually petrol retailers would have to publish live prices so that people could look at the signs on the roadside, or they could check on their phone. Apps would emerge to do this and work out, where is the best place for me to go and buy my petrol. And, this is important because, as a rule, you're driving along, you think, oh dear, I'm running out of petrol. You pull into the nearest place. You don't know how much the petrol is going to cost until you get there. Whereas if there was more transparency, if you could sort of shop around and decide, well, I'll go that way so I can go to that petrol station, they look cheaper at the moment, then it would be a more pro-consumer system. Then the retailers would have to, say, pass on a fuel duty cut to the customers rather than pocketing it themselves. Now, Harry makes the point in the article, nothing happens quickly in Britain. So that was 2022. It's now 2025, in case anybody hadn't noticed. And the CMA think that this may come into force by the end of the year. So there are two things that are interesting here. One is just the future of fuel duty in general and implications for the next budget. We can come to that in a second. But the other one is just about this CMA action and whether this is an appropriate light touch regulatory intervention, which actually we would welcome governments making in certain circumstances to kind of enforce a greater degree of price transparency. Now, I can see that it's not necessarily a pure market outcome, but at the same time, it may be a legitimate response to a market failure, which is a kind of asymmetry of information where customers don't have enough knowledge about prices, and so therefore they can't act in the most economically advantageous way. Is this a good way for government to go about steering things in the right direction? Should we see more of this? And I suppose the reason I was struck by it is because I once wrote a piece arguing for greater required price transparency in American healthcare. And it wasn't published because some of my colleagues, and I think they had good reason, thought it was very unsound from a kind of free market libertarian perspective. So I'm open to the fact that I'm just getting this one a little bit wrong. But the experience that inspired me to write that piece, and anyone who's sort of had interactions with American healthcare will know there are all kinds of oddities to the system which are quite hard to explain. And so this was a system where I had health insurance when I was living in America, which had a high deductible that meant I would pay a certain amount out of pocket before my insurance would kick in, to simplify a little bit. I went to the doctor. I think I needed some blood tests. And I said, look, I've got a high deductible. I'd rather just pay for this myself. How much is it going to cost? And they told me that, well, first they said, oh, we don't know. I said, well, could you find out? Is there someone you can ask before I come and have this, how much it's going to cost me? It's like, okay. They came back and they said, I don't know what it was, $100 or something. Reasonable enough. I had the procedure. I was leaving. I said, can I pay now? And they said, no, don't worry. You have insurance, so it'll just go through to your insurance company and then you'll pay the amount. I probably should have twigged that it wasn't going to work out the way I'd planned it when that happened, because then I got the bill, which had been sent to my insurance company, and then it come to me to pay the deductible, and it was like $600. And I'm like, well, hold on. I called them up and I said, you told me it would be 100. It's gone to the insurer. Now it's 600 for some reason, which I'm still paying out of pocket because of the high deductible. And they said, oh, I'm so sorry. We'll look into that. We did say it would only be £100. Didn't hear from them for a while. And then a new bill arrived and it was for some random amount like $38. I thought, well, fine, I'll pay that. But what an unproductive ring around that was. And also, the beauty of markets is that prices act as signals and they guide behavior and they coordinate activity spontaneously without needing any kind of central control. And so I just thought, if you have a market which is producer dominated, in which prices barely seem to exist until after the fact, how can you get optimal economic behavior occurring? How can the kind of spontaneous order and market-driven dynamism that we want to see occur in those situations? And I thought, well, maybe this is an area where a little bit of government intervention might go a long way. But again, there are always unintended consequences, and I'm open to the idea that I am, in fact, being deeply unsound when I say this.
With your first, Tom.
Well, I can't see a particular problem with state-enforced price transparency, and if that's unsound, then okay, then I'm unsound as well. But at the same time, in this particular case, going back to the Times article, wasn't quite clear to me what problem he's trying to solve. So he is saying in the same article that there are various apps that do this, but then he complains about one of those apps that you can only use it 6 times a day unless you are a subscriber. Well, okay, is that so terrible? Or that you sometimes have to flick between different apps. So it's not as if there are no market solutions, so that he wants a slightly more convenient solution. And so this sounds a bit like a luxury problem to me. But this also does show that we often do hold markets to absurdly high standards. And if there's some deviation from the textbook model, we immediately say, oh, look, there's this terrible problem and we need an investigation and massive regulatory action where we would not see that in the public sector. So.
I think the first question should be, from our perspective, to make sure we're being as sound as possible, is before we talk about state intervention, is there something that the state is already doing or a state adjacent body is already doing that is stopping this from working? And in the article, he makes a suggestion that actually there is one example of a highway services company who wants to be able to do this but can't because their applications for being more transparent about their prices are being blocked by the Highways Authority. So potentially we should look there first and then consider.
Absolutely. And shout out for the Moto M6 services at Rugby that he referred to in the article. The best motorway service station, I think, in England. I mean, I know this is niche stuff, but it's great, especially if you've got kids, lots of space, grass to play on, wide selection of food outlets. I promise we're not advertising the M6 services.
It sounds good, although, yeah, I guess you sort of have to be driving in that direction. I don't think I'll be paying an intentional visit.
I wouldn't go there for a day trip.
One last tiny question before we do wrap up on the fuel duty topic, because we were speaking about this externally earlier in the week, Tom. What the fuel duty question, because it either gets cut or is frozen at every budget, and as the aforementioned fiscal fragility that the Chancellor's looking at the moment, and a huge gap to fill, or growing gap to fill, as their cuts die a death at their backbenches. Do you think that we will see a fuel duty rise in the autumn budget?
Well, I mean, fiscal logic points in that direction, not least because it's already baked into the OBR forecast, as I understand.
Yeah.
So as things stand, next March, the 5p fuel duty cut should expire. And then fuel duty should rise for the new financial year in April with the RPI. When governments want things to rise more, they link them to the RPI. When they want them to rise less, they link them to the CPI. It's one of those funny things that happens in Britain's fiscal politics, but there you go. So that's sort of the baseline assumption that fuel duty will go up. If you make the more perhaps logical, politically driven assumption that it hasn't gone up for ages, it would be very unpopular if it went up, you might think, well, they're probably going to push that one down the road again at the next budget, but that just increases the fiscal gap that they're facing. It probably will then need to be plugged either by more borrowing, but that looks dicey, probably by some other tax. So I think that puts you in the position of thinking, well, what am I comparing it with? A fuel duty increase versus what? And actually, a fuel duty increase in those circumstances might be the preferable option, or the second best option after just cutting spending. But that might be a better, more efficient tax because it is in some sense a user charge for the use of the roads and their maintenance and everything else. And there are some environmental externalities and so on built into it. Maybe that is the more sensible way for the government to go. Will they go that way? I think probably not. And, look, it's worth saying as well that even though I just described fuel duty as akin to a user charge, I mean, we raise about 24 billion from fuel duty. We spend about 6 billion a year on roads. So it's clearly not hypothecated. It doesn't reflect the cost of road use unless you're making some quite heroic assumptions about social and environmental externalities. I think the other thing to mention with fuel duty is it's trending down generally because we're trying to shift everybody into electric vehicles. And that is another sort of slow motion fiscal hole which is going to emerge in the government's books, and that I think they're being too slow to address. And the way to address it, I don't want to launch us into a whole other topic at the very last moment, but I think we have talked about it before. It's one of my old favourites, road pricing. We should just scrap fuel duty. We should shift to a system of road pricing where people are paying a dynamic price that reflects the demand for scarce road space. And if you did that in a revenue neutral way, or even in a way that assumed revenue from motoring was still going to continue to decline, I think you could get significant savings for people who drive at quiet times or who live in places where there isn't a lot of traffic. Equally, though, rush hours, big cities, prices would rise to level out demand and to keep traffic flowing smoothly. I think something like this is kind of essential with the onset of electric vehicles. I mean, you can go all the way back to 2005, and I think the Eddington report, which is still one of those very good government reviews which no one paid very much attention to, he said there are basically two options. You can use pricing to manage demand, or you can invest massively in road building and new infrastructure. Now, given the fiscal constraints, given the problems we have getting anything built in this country, that doesn't seem like a very feasible option now, 20 years on, where we've had pretty limited road building in the intervening period. So I think for those two reasons, shifting from fuel duty to something which is more akin to proper dynamic road pricing just has to be the way that we go on this front. As for the forthcoming budget, though, I would expect them to just say fuel duty is very salient, has a strong kind of populist element to it, so they'll keep it frozen. They'll raise some other taxes elsewhere, which will probably be more damaging.
I'm okay with all that as long as we get enforced transparency for the price of road space at different times.
And on that note, that is all we've got time for. As always, check us out on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. And until next time, thank you very much.